So proud that we passed divestment, and it's a big step. And it's also one piece of the Palestine program we brought to the convention, which included support for workers who want to strike against weapons flows to Israel, included endorsement criteria, including cutting ties with the apartheid Histadrut. And our Palestine program was one part of our larger class struggle program that we brought to convention, which included fighting layoffs and fighting ICE. And so we have our work cut out for us. We are nowhere near done. I think the convention was kind of one pit stop or one tactic we're using in growing our class struggle movement, getting our politics out there, meeting other people who share the same politics and organizing around that.
Hi, everybody. My name's Andrew Bergman. I'm a co-chair of Unite All Workers for Democracy, UAWD, and I'm really excited to introduce you all to our roundtable today. We're going to be talking about UAWD's ConCon strategy and the role we played in winning divestment through our vision of class struggle. I want to tell you a little bit about what UAWD is for those of you who are tuning in who aren't familiar. UAWD is a grassroots movement of rank and file UAW members united in our vision of class struggle unionism and fighting to build a militant democratic UAW. About a year ago, there was a split in UAWD that many people may be familiar with. And since then, we have kept building on our vision of democracy, but recognize that democracy is just one piece of a bigger vision of class struggle, and that many of the reforms, the democratic reforms and the elections we won in the last few years actually didn't come to fruition. And what we recognize is to actually have a democratic union, we need a union that is also a fighting militant union and one where we're prioritizing worker control so that from the shop floor up to the top level of our UAW, we actually are not just considering the members and trying to engage the members, but actually having the members make decisions. And that means fighting just as much as it means voting and engaging in democracy together. We've developed a strategy over the last year to implement our class struggle vision that involves having local chapters that are actually fighting the boss on the shop floor. And that involves having our editorial board publish Daily Struggle, which is a publication that we've been printing. It's online. We've also been printing and distributing across the country to over 100 UAW workplaces. We've had 10,000 copies go out every quarter. And it's really started to impact not just this sort of fight on the floor, but actually how our coworkers think about it. And we're trying to have those two be two sides of the same coin, that we don't just think, but we actually act. And then we build our class struggle ideology into our actions. So before we jump into the panel, I just want to give shout outs, especially to some of the folks who aren't here today that helped build our strategy, not just for the last year, but specifically for the Constitutional Convention. And we'll talk about what the Constitutional Convention even was and is as we dive into the details here. But quickly, there's a couple people who aren't on our panel today, John King and Dave Park specifically, who helped actually serve as a strategy committee for the Constitutional Convention within UAWD and really helped build these ideas. Along with them are some of our panelists. So I'll introduce folks. First, I said, my name is Andrew Bergman. I'm a worker at General Motors at the Detroit Hamtramck facility, where we make electric vehicles. And I was a longtime member of the UAW in higher education. I'm also a member of Local 22. And I served as one of the off-the-floor leads at the ConCon, along with Navruz Baum, who's a paralegal in New York City, a legal services worker in Local 2325, and Nevena Wengler, who's also a worker at General Motors Detroit Hamtramck facility, and a member of Local 22. And then we had three on-the-floor leads, and we'll tell you more in the sort of introductions to come of what it meant to be on the floor and off the floor. But to just quickly introduce everyone, we've got Shelly Pires of Local 2325, who's a paralegal and a legal services worker in New York City. We've got Margie Thornton, who's a legal services attorney at Local 2320 in Colorado. And we've got Jeremy Bunyaner, who's also an attorney and a legal services worker at Local 2325 in New York City. So really excited to have sort of this great team of our on the floor and off the floor leads. The six of us are sort of the folks who anchored our strategy going into the Constitutional Convention. And the win we got, the win of divesting from Israel bonds, was really just one piece of a broader set of goals, and one piece of kind of what we set to do, and to use the ConCon to anchor our shop floor work and not just see it as the end all be all. So I want to jump into some of the sort of segments we have. We're going to have a few people sort of introduce pieces of what this all means, and then we're going to go to some broader discussion on our strategy and the impact we had. If you do want to kind of get takes and learn more about the broader significance of this win, a few of us have an interview coming out with Max Alvarez of the Real News Network, and we'll include the link in our notes. So please check that out. Today we want to focus more on the sort of broader sentiment, more than the broader sentiment. We want to dive into the nuts and bolts of the strategy we built and kind of have a how-to to give people a sense of the political foundation we built on and our analysis of what we encountered at the ConCon and how our predictions fared. We want to document how we did all of this and what we saw to give organizers on the left a leg up in the future when they're kind of engaging in these kinds of struggles. But we do also want to give credit to all the enormous work that's gone on over the decades to get us to the point where the UAW could even make the decision to divest from Israel bonds. And so to start off with that context, I want to hand things over to Shelly.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andrew. So we got this historic win of being able to not just, put the discussion of divestment onto the floor, which we weren't even sure if we were going to be able to do, but we actually managed to organize and use the space to ultimately have this vote that was successful, that passed to ensure that the UAW will no longer invest in Israel bonds. And so this moment, I say historic because it really is something that has been organized for decades and decades. The Arab Workers Caucus struck in 1973 against the UAW's investment in Israel bonds. So this is an over 50-year long fight. Even just when it comes to the Constitutional Convention, there was an attempt to introduce this to the Constitutional Convention the year after. Unfortunately, in that moment, the debate couldn't even get to the floor. And so we see it as just us carrying on the work of so many people, right, who have not just taken these fights over the political sort of spirit of what the UAW stands for to avenues like the Constitutional Convention, but also workers striking for issues like this, right? Like in 1969, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers struck for racial justice. And so we see ourselves as being part of that legacy, as well as, part of why this is so important. I mean, obviously, like there is a genocide in Gaza and it's still underway, and the ceasefire isn't real. People are still being killed, are still being oppressed, are still being subject to apartheid. And there has been tremendous complicity by the US government in the bombing and murder of Palestinian people. So we as people in the United States, in the Imperial Core, we have a huge responsibility to Palestinians, but also specifically as workers, we have you know, a responsibility to our fellow Palestinian workers. This was a call from Palestinian trade unions to support the BDS boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and to, use our power as workers to do everything we can to stop the genocide. And to be, clear, we as UAWD, divestment was sort of like the floor of what we were trying to achieve. One of our UAWD members had actually made who couldn't be on the call today, unfortunately, but one of our UAWD members actually earlier in the day had made a motion to try to pull out onto the floor our more robust amendment that would have not just called for divestment, but would have ensured that, the UAW doesn't put their political weight and our endorsements towards politicians who support the genocide, and would provide material to support to workers who actively get in the way of the war machine, right? People who work in weapons manufacturing who would, you know, use their labor action, withhold their labor to ensure that, weapons aren't being used to kill children in Palestine. So that was more so the vision of what UAWD was trying to bring. But even still, when through the course of the convention, we realized that the conditions were in fact, present for divestment to be a reality, and we pivoted, that ended up being this historic moment that, even though it is in some ways, it's like we said, the floor, it's more of like a reform rather than it is like a radical restructuring of what the UAW is doing. Even still, even just, this win, it took so much organizing, right? Like even just within, UAWD, we have members from across the country and across sectors, but also the conversations that we've had with folks, across the UAW, even just the locals that, passed our original amendment. There were several locals like Local 869, Local 2320 and 2325, 7092, 1115. So this was really a something that was broadly organized for that could not have happened without the organizing and support of so many people, but also was just, as Andrew was mentioning earlier, one part of our larger program to bring class struggle unionism and class struggle politics to the avenue of the Constitutional Convention in order to try to, put the UAW on a class struggle basis.
Thanks, Shelly. And yeah, that was an incredible introduction. Before we get into some kind of more discussion um, of our strategy, we have a couple more introductions we want to do so that everyone here listening gets a sense of how we even got to the point of having a strategy like this, and then what the setting was like. So we're going to hear from Jeremy in a few minutes about what the actual program we had was that Shelly was referring to. Before that, Navruz is going to give us a rundown of how we built this program. And I think it's worth mentioning, I should have said this up top. UAWD, as Shelly said, is made up of folks from sectors across the country, right? So we have hundreds of folks in UAWD who are coming from manufacturing. They're coming from small parts facilities. They're coming from big three sort of larger manufacturing plants. They're in the Midwest, they're in the South. And then we've got folks out West in higher education and working for the state government. We've got folks on the East Coast working in legal services and on campuses. So we really have this cross-sector group, and that is the sort of foundation for where we built our strategy. So Navruz, take it away on how we did all that.
Yeah, so we're here talking a lot of the events we're talking about are concentrated at the convention itself. But our process actually started almost a year before, in August of 2025 last year. We discussed and adopted at a membership meeting our strategy for how we wanted to approach the Constitutional Convention. This is pretty normal for us. We're a democratic organization, we're a membership organization, and so when we have a question of strategy and how we want of politics and how we want to approach something, we bring it to our membership meetings, we debate it, we have a proposal, we amend it, and then we end up adopting something. So last August, we passed a resolution laying out our general strategy for the Constitutional Convention. I just want to quote from it here because I think this is instructive. Uh, we'll use the ConCon for more radical political education of the UAW membership. about what action the UAW should be taking to meet the political moment, not on narrower reforms that could only be achieved with a large number of ConCon delegates. And I think Andrew up top laid out a little bit of the history of um, how UAWD's politics have shifted over the years. And this strategy was very much a response to the Constitutional Convention 4 years ago, where as UAWD, we also went and organized, and we had we had a very different strategy. We brought some narrower reforms, um, trying to increase strike pay and some other things. We had actually saw the most success with increasing strike pay. We passed that, and then the establishment reorganized and actually had another vote. I think the next day or 2 days later to roll it back, and so that demonstrated to us kind of the uphill battle we have in terms of trying to actually implement meaningful change, even very narrow change at the Constitutional Convention. So for this time around, we decided to be, we thought if the establishment is going to fight us tooth and nail, no matter how narrow our reforms are, we may as well come and say what we believe, and push our full politics. And so that's exactly what we did, and that's what this quote from our strategy resolution is getting at. That really we saw this constitutional convention primarily not, and the whole process leading up to it, primarily not as a place to pass reforms, but as a tool for political education to get our message out there and to bring it to the whole UAW. Last October, so a few months later, we set up a more concrete framework, and we actually formed our Constitutional Convention Strategy Committee, which led our process throughout. The committee was open to all UAWD members. A number of people joined. They put out surveys and had town halls and discussions with their members, and eventually put together our program for the Constitutional Convention, which we then eventually ratified at one of our membership meetings. And all UAWD members were open to submit things to that meeting for us to adopt and incorporate into our convention program. I think most of them were written and facilitated through the Convention Strategy Committee. And we had a democratic debate on what we wanted our program to be, what we wanted our priorities to be within that program. And I think most things were adopted, but not everything was. And some things were rejected as a result of that democratic deliberation. And then lastly, our convention strategy committee, in the lead up to the convention itself, put together a strategy for how we would manage the day-to-day strategy on the floor. And the convention can be a really chaotic place, where a million different things are moving or happening at the same time. Especially for someone like myself who's never been in the convention before, hasn't been in, I've done things with Robert's Rules for maybe a 2 or 3 hour union membership meeting, but I've never been at a 4 day convention like that. And so going in with a plan, with different roles delegated to different people, everything from who's gonna make the motion, who's gonna second it, to who's making sure we have lunch because the session runs from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. and there's no breaks. Uh, and we need to make sure our delegates are on the floor to make the motions and vote on the things when they come up. Because also you don't get an agenda in advance. There is an agenda. It's secret though. The delegates don't get it. We didn't get it. And so we don't know when our thing is going to come up. So we have to be on the floor all the time. And so we have people assigned to bring sandwiches and hand them over the barrier to our delegates. So figuring out all these logistics was one of the final tasks of our convention strategy committee, making sure we had all our bases covered. And I think our experience from the ConCon 4 years ago helped us and really gave us a leg up with this. This is not our first time around the block. But that, yeah, our committee was really crucial, making sure we went in with a full plan to the convention itself as well.
Thanks so much, Navruz. And yeah, I think we'll hear more. So after we do a couple more sort of introductory bits, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about our strategy, and then we're going to talk about our tactics. And so we're going to hear a lot more about what Navruz was just getting at and how we actually had these different roles. Because again, we want this to be a little bit of like a roundtable discussion, but also a tutorial because there are many other organizers across the country that we hope will take up this strategy and tactics, and we want to kind of look under the hood with you all a little bit on that. Let's go to Jeremy so that you all as listeners know what was actually in our program. Navruz just laid out this kind of months of thinking and working. And I think Navruz sort of got at this, but we actually decided to do a lot less work than we did 4 years ago, right? So we decided to focus more on the politics, but less on the kind of grind trying to get this passed at every local. So as Shelly said, we did have every one of our resolutions passed at several locals, but we didn't spend, hundreds of hours pushing it out everywhere. So for that reason, it was very important that our political program was actually really coherent and really connected and made sense to our organizers so that when we got there, we could present it in a very clear way. So Jeremy, why don't you take it away on what was actually in our program?
So we had, I think, about 8 different resolutions, give or take, in the program itself. But because of the nature of the convention, we wanted to make sure that our political priorities actually made it to the floor. And so, in evaluating these various resolutions, amendments, we chose 2 priority amendments that we wanted to make sure would try to be brought openly at the convention. And so the first priority amendment was called Fight Layoffs with Work Sharing. And the idea behind that is because thousands of UAW members have been laid off over the last few months alone, which has, decimated workers' livelihoods, it's destabilized communities, and the UAW has really failed to mount an effective response. So the amendment to fight layoffs the idea was to mandate the right to work sharing in all UAW contracts. And rather than dividing the workforce, which is, laying off some while speeding up those who remain, when production slows down, work sharing provisions give workers the ability to distribute the remaining work democratically and more equitably. And this is an issue that's fighting or affecting many manufacturing workers right now, including Andrew Nevena on this call. So we wanted to make sure something real, not a technical, dues related fix, is instead something actually affecting people's shop floor experiences, whether they're working or if they're not working, and how the company is controlling their livelihood. That was actually talked about at the convention. So that was one of our priority amendments. And the other priority amendment, because we really only had 2, was abolish ICE and fight state attacks on workers. Because in the last year, ICE has escalated its assaults on working class communities. There have been raids, detention, political repression to divide and punish immigrant workers who are an essential part of the UAW and the broader working class and a lot of people's communities. Immigrant workers are targeted this sort of attempt to promote nationalism and nativism and undermine class solidarity. And so the amendment committed the UAW to bargaining contract provisions that specifically protect members from ICE, and as well as withhold union support from politicians who back ICE. And really importantly, sort of create this mechanism to have a local membership meeting where locals could have a vote on whether or not they're going to take strike action when ICE attacks a community like they did in Minneapolis earlier this year. The implication being the UAW actually supports such strike action, which is almost certainly would be mid-contract and unprotected by the contract. So those were 2 priority resolutions, and we can talk about later sort of how that actually played out on the ground. But we had other resolutions as well. And of course, and why we're having this conversation in this format is because our Palestine resolution, a piece of it got adopted by the convention and therefore the entire UAW. But divestment from Israel bonds was just a piece of our broader amendment, a resolution, which also included financial assistance for workers who take job action that interrupts research or manufacture of weapons destined for Israel or imperialist war zones, a refusal to endorse political candidates who support, weapons for Israel or otherwise complicit in genocide. And that the UAW would not be complicit with any organization that promotes any form of supremacy, such as the History. Um, so all three of these resolutions or amendments build capacity for militant strikes to win key working class demands. There's like a practical reason for these amendments, but they're tied to these broader political goals. And the other resolutions that filled out our program, which we thought we'd be unlikely to have the chance to bring, but thought were important to put forward to talk about at the local level in terms of sending them to the convention itself. And then, of course, you never know how things will actually go. So we wanted to be ready. Included membership control over strike authorization, membership control over UAW presidential endorsements, and fighting to abolish forced overtime, as well as fighting for a cross-border wage floor in UAW contracts. So these, political points, practical amendments, this program really was meant to sort of say, like, look, here are some politics that actually matter. It's not just, adding another standing committee to the local union roster, and trying to connect, uh, what's happening in people's lives, what's happening in their union, and actually how the union is structured. And, by raising these things, our hope in part was that we would actually activate or find people who support these ideas at the convention itself, and then more broadly throughout the UAW. Because if we're not going to get all this passed, the reason to talk about it is to see the people who actually care about these things, because those are people who we want to organize with, and people who may not know that there are others in the UAW who have these same concerns and cares and dreams for a better world and a fighting working class.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. And yeah, that goal to find our allies, even though the convention floor is such a bureaucratic setting with local leaders and staff kind of all maneuvering to try to move up the ranks, we knew that there were people out there who would be our allies, and we found many of them. And that's why, this program that Jeremy just described is so important. Not that it just be a radical program, although, UAWD is undeniably a class struggle organization, but also that it be our program for how we think just good trade unionists would actually build a fighting union in this moment, and that would appeal broadly. And I think that's what we did. So before we kind of get into the weeds and discuss our strategy, we wanted to do one last intro to just what it felt like to be out there on the convention floor, and then what it felt like to be an observer sort of doing organizing off the floor. So we're going to have Margie give us an insight to sort of being a delegate and a floor lead, and then Nevena will give us an intro into what it was like to be helping off the floor, and then we'll jump into discussion. Go for it, Margie.
I mean, I had a great time on the floor. It was really rowdy, more so than I expected, but I guess I should have seen that coming. When my introduction to kind of what the convention was going to be like was in the first few hours when I stood up to try to pull out our fighting layoffs with work sharing amendment. And I had some people really interested, and I had a gentleman tell me to get back to the kitchen. So that's kind of what it was like sitting in Region 4. Region 4 is 99% manufacturing workers, and then there were 4 delegates from legal services. So we were kind of an island. But I I feel like a lot of that was all in good fun, which sounds crazy. People were angry. They were angry and cussing us out, but at the end of the convention, we all had to hold hands and sing Solidarity Forever, whether they liked it or not. So, I mean, it was pretty interesting to watch. I don't know how into the weeds we want to go, but it was where I was sitting towards the back of the room, I could see where people would stand up when we would, try to call things out, and I could see people getting angry, and I could see people kind of being brave and taking a stand and standing up, even though nobody else around them was voting to pull things out of the committees. And that was something that was really fascinating for me to watch. And it was interesting for me to see, the way that people would respond to, someone they probably work with every day or in their local, try to stand up for something that maybe their leadership is telling them not to stand up for. Yeah, these are just, and I think it's interesting because these are delegates that are from across the UAW, right? They are elected by their locals to come to the convention. And as with all things in a bureaucracy, a lot of the times these people are just well connected, or it's a popularity contest who gets to come to the convention. A lot of people were disengaged on the floor and had no idea what they were voting for. They were just voting in lockstep with their leadership. But the purpose is supposed to be that delegates are supposed to come and represent the members in their locals and to vote in their favor so that our union is truly a democratic body. In practice, I don't know if that's exactly how it plays out, but that's the purpose. But it was just an interesting experience being on the floor as a delegate. I don't know. I think maybe my experience being a delegate was a little bit different from Shelly and Jeremy's because they were in 9A and they were surrounded maybe by more friendly delegates than I was in Region 4. But it was interesting because there were a lot of people who were very angry at us. I think the convention kind of dissolved into chaos at one point because so many people were seeing that they might have the opportunity to pull their amendments out of committee. And they were kind of following like in the steps of UAWD from the past convention and trying to stand up. And I had people turn and look at me, especially a gentleman in front of me who said he was like 3 months from retirement and he was just trying to get this stuff done. And every time someone tried to pull it out of committee, he would turn around and be like, "This is your fault," because I was wearing my UAWD button, so proud. So, but people know who UAWD, they know that we're the shitsters, is one of our companions always says. So, I mean, some people are angry at us. A lot of people think it's all in good fun, but yeah, I don't know.
Thanks, Margie. Yeah, and we'll talk in the discussion, I think, about the degree to which, this space is a lot of local leaders who are getting, hoping to get on staff and so kind of looking around and triangulating. So we can dive into what the space really is, but in principle and in practice, it's definitely not the same. Nevena, before we get into the discussion, do you want to talk about what it was like to be off the floor and engage and what the sort of structure of the space was?
Yeah, definitely. It is a wild space. I'll echo Margie on that. And I think watching this like pretty small group of people in this incredibly formal room, right? In the front of the room is this stage of all the international executive board sitting and staring out to the rest of the space, and huge screens with videos of or photos of different picket lines and strikes. So it looks incredibly fancy and formal. And then you have all the delegates sitting in their chairs facing there. And then there's a couple bleachers. And it wasn't just UAW members in the bleachers. It was also sometimes staff. It was, people who were just kind of interested in what was happening. But honestly, there really were not that many rank and file members in the bleachers. I think it says a lot of the extent to which people don't know that this is happening, and definitely an extent to which their locals did not highlight that you could go as a guest if you were interested, and you could actually witness what was being debated. And also how people were voting, because you could see right there. And so I think the whole time as a witness to all of that, I just kept thinking about the rank and file members at my plant, the over 1,000 people who got laid off, and the extent to which things were being discussed in that room that had no interest in what was happening to all of us on the shop floor, and how I felt like what UAWD was bringing up in those spaces, those were sometimes the only like conversations that I felt like were in direct dialogue with what we're experiencing in all of our shops. So I think being, the other part of it was that there's a great presence of UAWD in the way we were organizing each other, and we were not just being foot soldiers for our presidents. We were not just being foot soldiers for IEB. We were actually organizing together as a team. We literally did huddles at the rail between the bleachers and the seats, and I did take some, action photos of that, because I think it showed there's a lot of micro pressures. I think Margie obviously was not impacted by the harassment she received, but there's a lot of people who are, right? It can be a pretty nerve-wracking space to be in. And I think the fact that we were there as a team, we were there as a collective was was huge, and that us in the bleachers were able to kind of break through that wall of people possibly feeling isolated on the floor was also really big. Feeding people is definitely very important. It's another way I kind of feel like it's intentional. The lack of breaks is to like see who is the fittest, a survival game basically. And the last thing I'll also add is that, we were also handing out daily struggle. So it wasn't our purpose was not just who voted and who made motions in the meeting, was actually to engage in political discussions with people who were there, which was not happening, right? Like I think we were the only ones really handing out political content. We handed out our daily struggle publication, which is right here, and talks about, challenging the grievance procedure and fighting on the shop floor. And, I had two different experiences with that where I walked up to a group of men and was just excited to hand this to them and talk about it. And at first they were interested, and then their president walked up and he said, "Have a good day. Thank you. You can leave now." And to the other guys, I was like, "Oh, are you still interested in copy?" And the guy was like, "Well, my president says I can't take it." And I'm like, "All right." So we have a lot of people just following what their president is telling them to do. But there were so many other people who were really interested in this and really interested in actually hearing about our Abolish ICE effort in particular, and also about our fighting layoffs resolution. So I think, again, our emphasis was having political discussions that actually impact what's happening in people's lives. And I think that was really relevant.
Thanks, Nevena. So yeah, we've talked about some of the roles we had. We're going to do a little bit more on that when we kind of talk about our tactics. But we wanted to jump into discussion now, and we wanted to talk about how this class struggle strategy that all the panelists have been talking about in different pieces, how did it fare? And I just want to start out the conversation by saying that we as an organization, but me in particular, I came from the convention 4 years ago with the logic that we heard a few people describe about how we'd get fought on narrow reforms. Um, and so our strategy was built around a few of us who came from that convention saying we can't win anything. We can't even win a narrow reform. And we were wrong. We did win divestment. We did win a vote to divest from Israel bonds, and the UAW is now divested. And it's an incredible win. But I think it's important for us to understand that it didn't just come from aiming for that and then focusing all of our efforts on that and talking only about that. It actually came from everything that we just heard from our panelists, and this deeper strategy. So even though we were wrong, I think we were also right in understanding that we should appeal to the political sort of vision that we have, our class struggle vision, and not just fight for something narrow and see if we got it. So let's open it up. What do you all think? What's the what's the assessment? Were we right? Were we wrong? How did our strategy fare? How should we see? We don't have to think of it in black and white. And how did we get here, right? We talked a little bit about it, but there's a lot of different pieces that got us to this. The local work that we were all doing, the work that we were building, something together in UAWD. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this was as someone who I uh, sort of joined the Constitutional Convention Strategy Committee as a co-chair sort of later on in the process. Um, I will say that it was interesting campaigning to be elected as a delegate in my local because I mean local 2325, I don't think it would be incorrect to say that currently we have the largest and most solid UAWD chapter right now. Part of trying to get our politics, our class struggle politics out there is forming local chapters. And 2325, we had a lot of members of UAWD before we had an ideological split last year, which someone else can touch more on. But we had already had several members. But then after the split and after we sort of recentered around class struggle politics more specifically, those are politics that do really resonate with a lot of folks in our local. So I was very happy and overjoyed, but also not necessarily surprised that our whole slate of delegates that we ran was elected to go to the ConCon, six of us as primary delegates and one of us as an alternate delegate. And so that just made it very clear that, It's the fact that we like we're building towards campaigning towards sending people to ConCon and sort of campaigning around that sort of helped really solidify our chapter. And I think our chapter being solidified is the reason why, for example, here on this call, we have 3 members of 2325 who are Flora leads. Our delegates who we had were also very sort of well versed on like what our platform was and what our strategy was and how we were going to get things out. And so I felt on the one hand like prepared and like I'm around great colleagues, around great folks going into this. But on the other hand, the sort of difficulty in campaigning, what I felt is that we knew how anti-democratic the space can be and what it's been like in the past. And it was sort of, I think normally when you campaign, it's like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to win us this. And to be frank, like Andrew mentioned, we didn't think that we were going to win uh, having any of the amendments that we thought were that we put forward. We didn't necessarily think that they were going to pass, and we thought that it would be a huge struggle to even pull them out of committee and get them to be debated on the floor. We think it's a huge success that 2 of our amendments we managed to get discussed on the floor. The divestment one, which ended up being a huge win, and our one on abolishing ICE and fighting state attacks on workers. That one, I was the one who made the motion to pull that out of committee, which is the process that you need to do to take something that's not on the official agenda and put it on the agenda. That requires this sort of 15% of the delegates threshold. And at like over 800 delegates, that was something like 120-ish delegates. So we originally thought that we had to lower that threshold because we didn't think that we were gonna be able to get that many people to agree to want to talk about the stuff that we care about. And yet I felt very moved and very touched that a lot of people did want to talk about abolishing ICE and fighting ICE as workers. And I say that, and I think it's an important takeaway that once people realized that, oh, we're pulling things out of committee now, like Margie mentioned earlier, there were definitely several people that tried. And I would say that there were a lot of things that weren't successful, either A, being pulled out or B, passed, that were arguably less controversial than what we were putting forward with our amendments. So I think it speaks to the fact that we were really reading the room and reading the moment as far as like, this is what people care about now. And regardless of what the sort of bureaucratic, maybe anti-democratic forces in the room may be thinking, it's like no one can deny that this discussion is important and it has to be had. And I think that I definitely, when I pulled the motion out, and we were discussing it, and later on when we voted on it, I got to speak to motivate it. Definitely there were objections that I was sort of facing based on things like legality and, oh, well, we don't want to place constraints on endorsing politicians. But overwhelmingly, while there were people sort of passing other people's concerns on to me there, which I found interesting, overwhelmingly, it felt like the spirit of what we had in that amendment, folks really understood, and the fact that we could get our politics out there, not just that it's important to fight ICE, but also what role we as workers can play in that. I think that felt like a really huge success of our strategy. That felt like a win in its own way.
Turns out people hate ICE. Who'd have thunk it?
Seriously, I mean, even people who spoke against our resolution began it with saying, first of all, fuck ICE, but the legality is what we've got to worry about. And I think that was really amazing because it was revealing, right, the real intentions of people trying to shut it down is at the end of the day, they want to have peace with bosses. They don't want to engage in, illegal strikes or strikes that are outside of contract expirations because at the end of the day, they actually just want to have labor peace with management. But I also got on because I want to really emphasize, I think, the strategy UWD has to develop chapters, and we have a chapter at Local 22 as well, which has been crucial in us fighting shop floor issues at our plant. But I think the 2325 chapter, the cohesion that comes with that was huge for ConCon. I think the fact that you all have already built so much trust with each other in your local, right? You're actually coming from a place of fighting shop floor issues at your own place. And the fact that you guys had already passed that resolution to say, we're going to have a meeting to discuss about going on strike against ICE if ICE ever invades our community. You guys already did that. You already engaged with something that was challenging the whole like, oh, we can only go on legal strikes or whatnot, right? And so I think that the chapter development of UAWD emphasizes our belief that we need independent formations in our shops in order to fight management and in order to fight the bureaucracy that wants to be at peace with management. And I think it's really amazing to think about what would it look like if we had 2 more chapters, 3 more chapters. I mean, for bargaining convention, we had so much influence with one chapter that anchored our effort. There were delegates from other locals. We also have, manufacturing people who ran and didn't win delegate positions. So like UAWD is 50-50 in terms of manufacturing and the other sectors. But we have a couple really strong chapters like 2325. And I think the split, the group that tried to dissolve UAWD, their theory of change is through top positions, right? Is through top bureaucrats setting the tone, reforming it from the top. Our belief is that it has to happen through independent organizing and political principle and discipline on the shop floor. And I think Local 2325 chapter did exactly that and really anchored our effort. And I hope brings us to actually encourage people at other shops to also build up their rank and file team that don't have to be foot soldiers for their union leadership or for their regional reps or directors, but actually is tethered most importantly to the rank and file of the shop.
Yeah, I see an arc that played out really over the last several years, but especially the last year. A couple people mentioned it now, right? This split in UAWD came out of a sort of reform faction that wanted to focus just on basically being the Sean Fain fan club, right? And they tried to kill the organization because they didn't like that there was a sort of a more radical class struggle wing developing that wanted to talk about what it meant for us to have a union that went much beyond just fighting fights on the shop floor. It wasn't antagonism about Fain in particular, but it was a view that we needed to do more, right? That the winning on the shop floor is beyond just your workplace. You actually have to fight a class struggle between the working class and the capitalist class. So that I think so many of the things that folks have already mentioned, um, the fact that we even had a discussion about ICE, the fact that we even had a chapter like our 2325 chapter. I mean, I don't, you know, the folks from 2325 should say, but just as an outside observer, I don't think we even have that without this split and this ability to articulate class struggle politics more clearly and not just this narrow reform vision. I don't think any of this actually ends up being possible. And so, I mean, no one planned it that way. No one was like, let's have a cataclysmic sort of event that's really acrimonious and really personally contentious for many of it, right? Many of us here went through a really challenging time when these other folks tried to really undemocratically, basically, like, undermine our comms, undermine our funding. And yet, persisting through it and developing a clearer vision as a result is actually why we got this win. And I don't think anyone ever realized that. No one was ever like, oh boy, let's keep going and we'll win, Israel bond divestment at the next ConCon. That is not what we set out to do a year ago. We set out to build a durable sort of political program, like everyone said, on the shop floor. And multiple people said that we have one chapter in Local 22 manufacturing shop, one in our West Coast sort of public sector workers shop, and one in 2325. UAWD only has 3 chapters. We don't hide this. We have probably 7 or 8 more coming up from different people, here and beyond in UAWD starting to anchor it. But we have so much more to build. As someone said before, if we had 5 or 10 chapters going into this ConCon, imagine what we could have done. We only had like 25 delegates in the UAWD contingent out of over 800. So our ideas are making a difference, not just our numbers. And we go beyond that. And I just want to, before I pass to someone else, the outcome for me actually that was most incredible, even though the divestment win was really beautiful and an inspiring victory, I think the debate we had about ICE that Shelly was talking about was actually like, I mean, that for me was the highlight of the convention. Shelley's speech in particular, I think we'll all probably feel this way, but I just have to give a shout out. People should check it out on Instagram. You can see a recording of it. It's so beautiful. Like it was so inspiring. What was also incredible about it wasn't the only speech. There were actually two speeches from older folks who had been manufacturing workers for decades. One of them not being even connected to our politics. One of them actually kind of being a stodgy old sort of bureaucrat who still got up and gave this incredibly eloquent speech about how if we're not ready to take illegal, unprotected action to strike in response to ICE, then when are we? I didn't think I'd ever hear anything like that in this very bureaucratic setting on the convention floor. So, this arc over the last year got us to a point where we were able to move people's brains. And I will say, I don't think we get the divestment win if this debate about ICE didn't happen 3 hours earlier. That really, I think, moved the political and sort of moral window of the convention floor. I don't think the divestment win, because it's worth noting, our ICE resolution failed 75-25. I think a lot of people sat in their seats and voted no, even though, as Shelley said, their sort of heart and their conscience was aligned with it. So when you as the top bureaucrats tell people like, nope, you have to vote no, even though you like something, I think that impacts people. And I think it's a big part of why we were able to win divestment just hours later, because a lot of people were like, shit, we need to at least have some moral win come out of this.
Yeah, it was. I really agree with that. And part of how we structured things, we did have space for, on the floor tactical decisions. We came in with, ideology, we came in with a coherent politics, but we weren't rigid in how we actually approached, you know, accomplishing our goals. And, in my heart, I will say this, I wanted to make sure we had that strategic flexibility because, I've lived in this world for the last 3 years. I've seen how, divestment particularly and just, the world and the working class has shifted around the issue of Palestine, where there have been strikes and all sorts of, fights and various things at the rank and file level, not just in the UAW, but in many unions, it's like maybe we could get this, but it's important we had our plan because it allowed us to come sort of with this coherent vision and with a solid approach that actually moved people along with us as we put it forward at the convention. And so I just want to echo what Andrew was saying, like without that, having that ICE discussion, it's something, even those who were opposed, wanted to put on the record that they oppose ICE. And just as an aside, a lot of this is like, there's the chair who is either the president, the vice president, or the financial secretary of the UAW is sort of chairing the meeting at the microphone up top on the stage. And then this other, delegate on the microphone is sort of like back and forth in this sort of conversation. So they're speaking to both the convention delegation, but also to the chair. And there's this sort of like multiple conversations happening all at the same time. And sort of in that environment, we had to decide when are we going to intervene, what makes sense to do. And it's a 4-day convention. So we had meetings after each day where we, reflected on what we had seen, how we thought things were going, and what we thought made sense for the next day, and how we could stay on track with implementing our plan. And the night before we were able to pull the divestment resolution out of committee, we discussed, do we want to go straight divestment or do we want to actually bring this bigger vision, which, I should say, I talked about a little bit before, but the idea being like, what are the Palestinian trade unions actually asking us to do? And also, what are the actual ways our union is complicit in genocide? And it's not just in owning bonds, it is the weapons manufacturer and our relationship to that. It's the relationship with these labor organizations. It's all the things we discussed earlier. Um, and so we put that forward, and we made sure that was, that motion was made. It didn't pass, but we had time because we knew to do it early to then bring the narrow divestment resolution forward. We made that tactical decision, and it was actually the last thing that was pulled from committee before the rules were suspended, and no other amendments could be brought out of the book and debated at the convention floor. So we got it in just under the wire, and we were very aggressive, I guess I should just say. The mechanism you do that, you actually had to, under the rules, you had to, get recognized by the chair. So it's like you're waving a flag, you say, hey, look at me. And Margie talked about earlier, in Region 4, people kind of in the back of the room scrambling to try to be heard, not everyone being heard. You weren't necessarily going to be recognized, and a savvy chair can just ignore people. Or alternatively, I think we saw a little bit of a savvy chair allowing everyone to speak to run the clock. And so these sort of, everyone's got their little tactics, right? It's what, 800 plus delegates. So it's sort of this swirling thing. And, we had to think, okay, how do we effectively put in our plan and relate to what's actually happening in a way that maybe we could win. When we saw that opening, we went for it because we saw that people beyond just ourselves wanted divestment.
And I think maybe we should touch on from like a strategic point of view. We've talked a lot about like logistics and our process and our steps, but also I can't overstate the importance of being there as a coalition, as a group, and knowing that people like we're gonna have your back in a hostile environment. Because what we're doing was not popular. And like even just knowing like several times Jeremy came walking up on behind me just to be like, are you like, do you have this? Like, are you going to be okay when it was going to be my turn to stand up in front of 1,000 people and say something that 95% of them were going to boo at? And that just makes a massive difference. And so you can have the most radical politics and, you want your union to do, you know, amazing things. But if you don't have a group of people there who are going to stand in solidarity with you, then that progress is never going to happen. So I feel like strategically, the most important thing was us going together as UAWD.
And Margie said one thing about I think sorry if I'm putting words in your mouth, but about like 95% of people being against what we had to say. And I want to respectfully disagree with Margie because when we actually I think a lot of people initially were very open to what we had to say, very excited about it. And then eventually they were against it once they were told they were supposed to be against it by their top leadership. And others mentioned earlier how there was a lot of kind of 99% of the convention was these narrow technocratic reforms. And many of them weren't placed on the agenda, just like our program wasn't placed on the agenda. People tried to pull them out. A lot of that failed. Um, we actually had a pretty good success rate of pulling our things out of committee. Because, for example, when Shelly got up there and read our ICE resolution, people are really mad about ICE. And we don't have to convince them to be mad about ICE. People already are. People have had personal experiences with ICE. People's family members have had personal experiences with ICE. And so when Shelly made the motion to pull that out of committee and put it onto the agenda because the leadership had excluded it from the agenda, we had, I think, over 150 delegates stand. We actually had 162 delegates stand to take that out of committee. That's actually more than eventually stood for our divestment amendment. 162 stood to pull ICE out of committee. 147 stood to pull divestment out of committee. And so initially, ICE was even more popular, or our amendment to fight ICE was even more popular than our amendment to divest. Now, divestment eventually passed and ICE eventually failed. on the actual substantive votes on those amendments. So how did ICE start more popular than divestment, but then end up failing while divestment passed? And what happened is there's this 2 day period. On Tuesday, we made the motions to pull them out of committee. On Thursday, it was the actual substantive votes. And so the popularity of our ICE amendment uh, plummeted over those 2 days, or at least folks' commitment to vote for it plummeted over those 2 days. And what we heard happened. So every day, just to give folks a little bit of a picture, every day before the committee sessions themselves, there's this caucus meeting that happens before the session itself. It's actually in the basement, in the floor below the convention floor. And that's a private caucus meeting that's led. It was led by Sean Finn and Laura Dickerson and the other members of the International Executive Board who are in this united slate, which is kind of the renamed, reconfigured administration caucus, which has controlled the UAW for decades. And this caucus meetings are a long tradition. They have them. The administration caucus has these caucus meetings at every single convention going back decades. And in that meeting, they organized really hard against our ICE resolution. And they said, hey, delegates, and we weren't invited, but to these caucus meetings, not that we necessarily would have gone even if we were invited. But we heard from folks who were invited that they got up there, the IB members got up there at the front of the room and really urged delegates to vote no on the ICE amendment. And they said, I mean, hey, we hear you guys. We hate ICE as much as the next guy, but we shouldn't really be sticking our necks out as the UAW to fight ICE. Now, with divestment, I think that there's just a lower cost to the UAW to divest than to support their members who are striking against ICE. Supporting workers who are striking against ICE would almost certainly invite lawsuits from the federal government, from the bosses. Divestment is just a safer, narrower route. And then also, I think there's this really broad movement. There's this really broad divestment movement that's much larger than the UAW and labor. And within the UAW, there's been this divestment. People have been sounding the drum for divestment for a few years now, very, very consistently. And in some ways, even going back to the 70s, as we mentioned, the Arab Workers Caucus. And so in their caucus meeting, they actually stayed neutral on our divestment amendment. I think they didn't see it as big of a threat as they did our amendment to fight ICE. And so they stay neutral, and then it passed. And what all of this illustrates for me is how controlled and top down this convention is. I mean, they have the caucus meetings, as I think Margie mentioned. Some people would stand up, and then they would get pulled down by the presidents or by the other people in their local who are telling them, "Oh, you're not supposed to be standing for that." And so it showed me how controlled it was, but it also gave me a glimpse of what is, in a certain way, a symbol of democracy in the UAW. How the UAW really could be a democratic organization, right? There are these delegates from every local, and when folks were free to vote their conscience before leadership really organized against our ICE amendment, people were pretty pissed off, and people stood up for honestly a pretty bold resolution that would have really maximized our power using our labor power to fight ICE.
I do think there is kind of another dynamic that we haven't explored as far as the discrepancy between the ICE amendment and the divestment amendment and the amount of people that stood up to pull it out versus the amount of people that voted yes. And that is that the ICE amendment was a voice vote. And there were hundreds of international reps sitting behind us on the floor that were participating in voice votes. They were loud, and we didn't even know that they weren't supposed to be voting until towards the end when somebody made a point to have the sergeant of arms remove them from the floor for a vote because it was a controversial vote. And so I think that while the voice vote sounded like 25%, yes, 75% no on the Fighting ICE amendment. Had we stood up, I think it might have looked different. And I think in the future it will be important for us to insist on a counted vote because the voice votes are not democratic. I don't know why the union is doing it, having these people sitting on the floor who could be voting, who were absolutely voting and very loudly throughout the entire convention.
That's a
Yeah.
really interesting point, Margie, with the voice vote. And actually, on the final vote on divestment, we voted three times on it. First, there was a voice vote, and from where sat in the bleachers, the voice vote pretty clearly failed. Divestment had failed. I was ready to pack it up and go cry in my hotel room at that point. But then we did a raised hands vote. And I think it's a little harder for the international staff to kind of slip into a raised hands vote because everyone can see who's raising their hands. And that looked pretty even to me. And then we did, and I really wasn't sure how it was going to go once everyone raised their hands for and against. And then I was really sitting forward on the front of my seat and holding my breath. And then we did a counting vote where it probably took 15 minutes, but everyone who said they were voting yes stood up. There was these five auditors who went out and counted each person individually. Then everyone stood up for no. This suspense really designed to maximize suspense. And then it won, I think, like 53% to 47%. So really, really close vote. But I was very convinced that it failed. I think it pretty clearly did fail on the voice vote. So that's a really interesting point you make, Margie, in terms of who exactly was participating in those votes.
Yeah, the final vote I believe was 327 for 281 against.
I think it's 321, 287.
321 to 87, sorry. But yeah, so I don't know if that was like closer to 56% or something, but yeah, it was very, very close. So which made the moment when the count was announced just this incredible, like amazing, cathartic, celebratory moment.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what we just these like weird machinations, I think it underlies the role of this very bureaucratic caucus space, which really again is just, as Navruz said, the administration caucus of decades old renamed. We heard multiple people, they gave out little tickets, right? So how do you get a ticket? Well, you get it from your international rep. And the international rep gives it to a local president who then can give it to their delegates and they choose, right? They choose. It's like a little piece of candy. Oh, if you're on the right team, you can get a ticket. And I heard multiple people say that they were being told by reps, well, if you want a shot at being on staff, you better be in that caucus meeting. And that's just saying the quiet part out loud. Basically, everybody knows that. A lot of the role, even going to this convention, is to kind of vault yourself into a position. And this is not to say everyone there is doing it, right? We had our delegation and there are people beyond that. But for many people, probably the super majority, that's why they're there. Or at least it's a piece of it. It's one of the reasons they're there. And they know they're being watched. They know it matters what they stand up for. And they want that shot. And not that many people get on staff, but there's several hundred people at this convention trying. So, right? So it's a little rat race and people are climbing over each other. And so even though I totally agree with what Margie said, that the voice vote mattered because all these people who shouldn't have been voting participated, I think there are still hundreds of people out there who, when it comes time to vote, don't vote their brain or their conscience. They vote against, and I think on the ICE vote, I still don't think we would have won ICE as much as, I think you're right, we would have been closer because so many people, wanted to make sure that they were being seen. And there was this threat, we put out, we wanted to actually build strike capacity. We wanted to be able to hold membership meetings to enable the rank and file to decide if our union would take action in response to strike. And that scared the bureaucrats deeply. I think they saw that as an existential threat.
So, I mean, the tactician brain in me just wants to emphasize, like, Robert's rules is in part designed for these giant in-person meetings. I think a lot of people's regular experience with meetings is maybe farther away from this like more traditional, 19th century meeting structure. But like there are mechanisms to like divide the floor so you force the count because depending where you're sitting, you don't know what people like you're going to hear more things. Like from where I sat, I was of course yelling I as loud as I possibly could. Sounded like things passed, right? But depending where you're sitting, things are different. But just to like really underscores Andrew's point, there's a script that a decades old script at these conventions, and you're actually required to give your name and your local. Then what you're not required to do, but it's understood you should, is then state about five adjectives um, to sort of emphasize how wonderful your regional director and your assistant regional director are. And it's actually quite shocking if you've never been. It's just like that. This sort of like obsequiousness it's like medieval. It's um, and very surprising. And then this is just totally a tangent, but actually some of the people we're looking for in we were hoping to find are people new to these spaces who are actually very shocked. Like, well, this is how it works. This is how the sausage is made. Um, Wait, what do you mean these people don't support fighting ICE? Like, um, some people were very upset that this lost, but they don't have the context of how these bureaucratic structures work in so many of these locals of various parts of the country. And if you're from a newer local, which is just as a newer culture, your relationship to the bureaucracy is going to be different than if you're a local that's existed since 1942 and is in the big three. So there's just quite a lot going on, and it's a very strange environment. But you can in fact push things through. At least you could at this convention.
Yeah, and I think that what Jeremy's talking about in terms of how we brought, for example, the ICE amendment, and then it was organized against and crushed by top leadership, and this kind of moment of realization that some folks had seeing that play out. And I think that happened to a lot of the delegates. And that's one of the reasons we brought these things. I mean, I think that we brought an unapologetic vision, and best case scenario, we bring it and we pass it. And the UAW is the vanguard of a militant, renewed working class movement here in the US. But worst case scenario, we bring it and it's crushed by the bureaucracy. But a bunch of people see that, and we connect with these people, and we can start discussing what the true nature and politics of kind of the UAW structures are, and then how we can that starts a conversation about how we can organize to change that. And so one of the best parts of convention was before the session each day, we were in the halls, in the lobby, talking to delegates as they were walking in. We also talked to people on the floor and in the evenings over beers. And we tried, this was one of our primary goals at convention, was to meet people, to discuss politics, to discuss the nature of UAW structures. And in the beginning, I mean, we were talking to a few people, but after the first day or two, they started recognizing us. And once we said we were with UAWD, they were like, "Oh, you guys are the people who got up and talked about fighting ICE, and you guys are the people who got up and talked about fighting layoffs." And no one else here is getting up to talk about these urgent emergencies for the working class. And so then that was a really great conversation starter for talking to some people about what a more class struggle version of the UAW could look like.
So hopefully everyone can see how much fun, we're having analyzing this and have had analyzing this. The politics feeding the strategy, feeding the tactics. And we've actually already kind of sort of stretched over from our strategy into our tactics. So we already talked about a lot of the different roles, folks had as leads off the floor, leads on the floor. Jeremy was talking through some of the different ways that we were developing our politics into these tactical sort of I wouldn't call it, we were doing tactical games, and we had to respond to the tactical games being played from the front of the room, and we had to develop our own. So I think we've actually gone through a lot of these little tactics, but I think there's a couple of things on the floor that really worked. It'd be great to cover. And then I'd love for our folks off the floor, which was me, Nevena, and Navruz, to also talk a little bit about the organizing and the distributions that we did, which are an uphill battle, right? This whole place is curated to keep you focused on the podium, not on what you want to do, just on what the leadership are telling. And so anything you try to do to build conversations or build connections off the floor, it's just cutting against the grain. And so it's really challenging. So yeah, we're getting towards wrapping up. Anyone want to do a little bit of that on the floor tactical analysis?
Yeah, so, well, one thing that I think is important, part of why I really like organizing with UAWD is precisely that there are workers across the UAW who have experience and knowledge and a really strong analysis of these dynamics that have been playing out. And it gave us the ability to approach this, because we've been talking about getting our politics out onto the floor. And to be clear, we had daily struggle, right? We could go and flyer. I think that that is something that a lot of groups with politics maybe similar to ours are already used to and familiar with. I think what we really benefited from is precisely the fact that we have, folks across different uh locals and sectors and across the country, and also that we are thinking about the features and contours of this space and how we can use every bit of it in order to precisely get those politics across. So for example, right, like in Robert's rules, in order to get called on, it's especially at a meeting like this, like you often have to like get like a colored like folder or something and like raise it really high. And you have to sort of say why it is that you want to be recognized. So a lot of the times sort of the easiest way to do that, especially if there's already like a motion on the floor that's being debated, there are certain types of things you can say in order to get recognized, even if something's being debated. So for example, you could say point of order or point of information, right? And I think that as it's taken me some time, and I'm glad that I was like sort of trained and sort of primed and educated in advance, but it's important to note that like these rules and these sort of features that are meant to sort of be used to just sort of procedurally move the meeting along and sort of most of the control of the meeting ends up staying in the chair's hands. You can use those little procedural features to get on the mic and make your political points, right? Like this was happening a lot when we were discussing divestment, because a lot of what would happen is that they would move around the room to different regions in order to have discussion on things, but someone could call the question and end debate before it gets to your region. So how are we going to get our important, points out there if the question is called before us? Well, you make your points of order and your points of information, and try to be relevant and question what's out there, and also read the room, understand like when folks are going to be very clear, like, this person is like they don't have any reason to be up at the mic, but like make it clear when the financial secretary treasurer is making claims about what we can and can't do, or our financial secretary is saying what we can and can't do with our finances and is just wrong, right? And be clear on that, but also be clear on centering why it is that we're doing what we're doing, right? This is a picket line and we walk picket lines, we don't cross picket lines. I think it's very important to, as I think Andrew made this point earlier, but it's like we're not just here to be like, what should radicals do? How should radicals think? We are here to talk to all of our fellow trade unionists. And so it's important to know how to use the features of the space in order to forward those politics. And it's tough. Andrew was just saying, and I think it's very true. Like as a delegate, I'm like, okay, I gotta pay attention to everything that's happening and all of these like, resolutions that are being passed. And, there's so much pomp and circumstance, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like you actually have to stay focused on what you're there to do, what you're there to bring, and you can't lose sight of that for a moment, which was very it required me to really engage all my senses at all times. But that's why I was really, really glad that I was there with UAWD, that we had organized, that we had planned so much in advance, and that I wasn't alone. I was with my comrades.
When I'm a legal services worker, I have my little corner of the world that I exist in. I like got a job and that happen to have just unionized. Like I found myself in the UAW, and it's can be disorienting, and being on strike, you learn more about the international and how it can affect your livelihood, your ability to pay your rent. But um, you go to a place like this convention, and you realize the UAW really is, I mean, for all its many, many, many flaws, like it is a workers' organization. Um, co-opted in many ways, less powerful or strong or militant, and than we would certainly like to see. And well, no, in the United States, let alone the world. However, it is a working class institution to whatever that means in the United States. And like these are people you can talk to about, work, and these are people you can connect with. And these are not people who just will stare at you with blank eyes when you bring up, militant ideas like striking or withholding your labor to fight ICE. And, if you're familiar with ideas like business unionism, class struggle unionism, labor liberalism, you kind of see these ideas reflect realities, like how people live, exist, actually are. And I mean, I just keep going back to this sort of like uh bureaucratic guy who just says, I know the contract, sometimes fuck the contract. I mean, he said it more eloquently than that, but it was like, I was like, wow, this is American labor. This is business unionism and sort of how it actually can be powerful. And that there really is a working class, and it can be a mass movement. And it's actually worth organizing in.
Yeah, I want to say and I think Jeremy is making this point too, on this sort of conversation about tactics, which I'm actually glad we're keeping brief because I'm actually kind of proud. I mean, we should, anyone who's interested, DM us. We'll give you our full tactical playbook. It's on our website. It's not that we're hiding it, but I think we were intentional about not focusing on tactics because, as many people have described, this wasn't about reform, and we're not against reform. We want to transform our union into a class struggle union. There are many things that need to be reformed to do that, but it's not just reform. It needs to be bigger. It's culture shifting. It's shifting things from the shop floor and actually fighting the boss there and bringing our coworkers into it. So if we had just spent a year practicing tactics, we wouldn't have actually had the ripple effects that we wanted to, which was to actually educate our coworkers and really ourselves on what it looked like to be a serious class struggle trade unionist. So we didn't actually have the most developed set of tactics. That's the honest reality, is that people were like, we should do a mock convention next time. And I agree with that. But we didn't spend weeks and weeks practicing tactics. What that meant was actually kind of fun because many of the folks here who are on the floor, I think we watched from the bleachers them get better at the tactics throughout the week, right? So at the very beginning, nobody was comfortable making a point of order, a point of information. It took a few tries to even get recognized and get our resolutions, sort of voted on to come out of committee. And there were kind of back and forth where everyone's like, oh, I don't know, should we jump in? And by the end, many of our delegates, not just the leads here, but many people were like, fuck it. If they're going to get up and say point of order and then just make a point about something, then we're going to do it too. We're going to undermine this BS sort of game that they're playing by also getting our words in when something's not supposed to be debated. And so I think that shift, even though, sure, we could have practiced for weeks and weeks and been really ready off the rip, our folks got there because all of our delegates were so bought into our program that the tactics really did flow naturally from what we were doing. And I think we saw that off the floor too with our distributions, which we had our whole crew getting really involved in.
Yeah, I think adding on to that, I did mention earlier about us handing out Daily Struggle and how important it was. But I think that, the fact that there could be a big dissonance between the organizing conversations we were having and then the kind of success that we had on the floor in ConCon, which again, we were surprised by. I think that, for example, on Wednesday, which was the morning after Shelly made the motion and people voted to debate our anti-ICE resolution, the conversations were pretty electric. Like we basically were asking every single person who walked by us, what do you think about the anti-ICE resolution? And personally, I love this approach because we're asking people genuinely what they think about it. We're not just giving them like a vote for me thing, which by the way, we do not endorse any current slate. And so I think it was really refreshing to be there as like an independent caucus there to actually talk about our politics, not just like vote for me. And asking people that, people stopped and answered. Of course, some people just like walked right by, but actually a fair amount of people stopped or asked, well, what is that? I don't know what you're talking about. And it opened up a conversation about it. And a lot of people were like, yeah, actually, like my boss pulled me in a couple weeks ago saying I needed to prove my citizenship. And we then talked about how that was being used to retaliate against them because they were actually a pretty, public figure fighting bosses on the floor. And so I think it was really incredible to hear how many people said they were supporting it and actually engaging in genuine discussion over that, but then ultimately seeing the votes, right? These are a lot of people who got these positions. It was done through, loyalty to their president, loyalty to their, chairperson. And I think that the fact that, we also didn't have as many people come to our event as we had wanted to. Of course, it was also raining and pouring that day. So I think Mother Nature played a role in that too. But again, I think that's why even though we're getting incredible press right now because truly this historic win that we pushed for and building upon the years of struggle by Palestinians, by Palestinian Americans and workers around the world, we really just have to stay focused on our emphasis on our chapter development and our organizing on the shop floor. That actually it is our organizing and activity against management that is our strongest bone, like strongest infrastructure we have to lean on. And so I think the dissonance between the successes we had with our organizing there and then the success we had through the votes in ConCon says a lot about the different bodies that we were dealing with in terms of the delegates versus again the million UAW members out there, 400,000 rank and file members who have no idea what happened at ConCon.
Yeah, that's really a great segue to where we wanted to close out. So yeah, for listeners, we're near the end of our program. We talked about our politics, we talked about our strategy, and then we got into the weeds on some of our tactics. We want to close out by just talking about the broader significance of our strategy and the win on divestment in particular, but also, the many losses that we had. And the fact that we have not transformed the UAW, that this win is huge, but it does not mean that we are at the end of something. It means that we're really at the very beginning. And yeah, I just want to give folks a chance to reflect on that broader significance. Um, I also think, yeah, we need to grapple as a movement in UAWD and as a union with some really sort of weird things that come out of a win like this, right? Because even though it was a huge symbolic victory, it was narrow. It might shift a lot of what UAWD is sort of thinking to do. There are folks already who've sort of come in from the bureaucracy with this kind of opportunistic take, being like, "Oh, we did it. This local did it," or this kind of guy who's been an old admin caucus goon for decades, he did it. And it's actually very challenging to discuss these dynamics. And so I actually think one of the reasons we wanted to do this roundtable at all is because in our long haul vision, we see discussing these dynamics openly as crucial. And we actually have to do this analysis and help other active folks think about what it means to be in this big, unwieldy million-person union. But yeah, I wanna kick to you all. What are the takeaways we should have, and where are we heading?
I'm so proud that we passed divestment, and it's a big step. And it's also one piece of the Palestine program we brought to the convention, which included support for workers who want to strike against weapons flows to Israel, included endorsement criteria, including cutting ties with the apartheid Histadrut. And our Palestine program was one part of our larger class struggle program that we brought to convention, which included fighting layoffs and fighting ICE. And so we have our work cut out for us. We are nowhere near done. I think the convention was kind of one pit stop or one tactic we're using in growing our class struggle movement, getting our politics out there, meeting other people who share the same politics and organizing around that. Um, I also just want to highlight we passed divestment at the convention not because we had I mean, we had a lot of one-on-one conversations, but there was a lot of people who are already very pro-Palestine and understand the need for divestment in the convention. And that's because that's a credit to the years of organizing that other organizations of the UAW, like Labor for Palestine, has been doing. That's a credit to the struggle that stretches back to the 1970s and the Arab Workers' Caucus. And even more so, this is a credit to the larger pro-Palestine movement that happens in our country, and in the world, in the global working class. And so many people at the convention, many of them understand the urgency of standing with the working class in Palestine, maybe because they are Palestinian or they're Lebanese or Syrian and have firsthand experience. But many others have just heard about it from maybe other community organizations they're part of, from the news, from social media, and the ongoing visibility of the Palestinian people. So many great organizers in the U.S. that make sure that this genocide can't just be swept under the rug. Um, this victory comes in the context of all that organizing. Um, and in terms of the work we have cut out for us, I mean, we take so much inspiration from other American unions that have already divested. I mean, UE, the UAW is the largest union that divested so far, but the UE has already divested. The painters have already divested, and so we were definitely very much inspired by those two unions, and of course, incredibly inspired by the global labor movement. And workers in many other countries have gone way farther than divestment. They've actually struck against weapons flows to Israel and cargo flows to Israel, and to materially stop that support for the apartheid state. And we wanted to do that. We brought that message to convention in our broader Palestine resolution that was voted down. But I think that these other unions show that in other countries show what is possible for us, and so we'll keep fighting for that. And so just like the UE and the painters and the global labor movement have served for inspiration for us, we hope that folks in other unions look to this divestment victory and remember that progress is possible. And I think we have friends and know so many other great organizers in other unions that are fighting this same fight really doggedly right now in other unions across the labor movement. And so I guess if there's any takeaway from this divestment victory, it's that people are pissed off about genocide. People are willing to buck business as usual, and progress, however incremental or insufficient in the moment, progress is possible, and we are moving forward.
Yeah, and so that was like I think a really great sort of rundown of the significance of this, especially the significance of the divestment win, um, as far as, just broader reaching implications of that. I am to speak about, I think, the significance of our participation in the Constitutional Convention and our program, right? The fact that we, got up there and we were sort of willing to, even if uncomfortable and at times unwanted, sort of like use the space to advance our politics. And, sort of like Margie was saying, like someone was like, oh, like, you're giving people ideas. This is thanks to you, et cetera. I mean, I really hope that the in some ways the visibility that we are getting, thanks to the divestment win, I would like to hope that there are a lot of people, specifically within the UAW, who see what we have brought to ConCon and see not just, oh, hey, like these people helped like organize to like, get this divestment win, but also that, oh, the politics that this group is bringing, hey, I really need that in my shop. Oh, like they were trying to pass an amendment about work sharing to fight layoffs. Like, because the fact of the matter is that, like I think Nevena mentioned earlier, we have like several folks in manufacturing, auto, and part suppliers in UAWD, but they weren't elected as delegates to get to the ConCon. And I think the ConCon inherently, this was a very, like, we put a lot of effort into this and it helped build a lot of structures and infrastructure for UAWD as we sort of have, pivoted post split. But I also think that we still have so much work ahead of us as far as building chapters and specifically really having our politics be vital and instrumental in conflicts and struggles that are happening in shop floors across the UAW. And so my hope is that, when all of the dust settles, right, and people aren't, just talking about like, oh, the UAW divest, this is incredible. Like once we have, fully celebrated and unpacked all of the significance of that moment, I really hope that folks are also like touched by the kind of group that we are, how we organize, our makeup, our vision, our politics, and are interested in discussing or not just interested in organizing in their shops, on the shop floor, around the issues that they're facing, in order to just face this question of like, hey, need to like I don't need to accept the boss's control over, my life to this degree that I have so far. And there are other people who agree with me in the UAW. To the extent that there are other people who got that message and are willing to join us, that would be the measure of success for us. So I really hope that we can keep that momentum going.
You need wins. Like when you exist in a massive contradictions in this crazy union and in this crazy world. So it's just nice. It's nice to see.
I think kind of my biggest takeaway is actually kind of zoomed out and looking at the convention as a whole is, whether it was people who maybe our politics don't align with, but they were standing up and they were angry that the people at the front of the room were not listening to them and their voices were not being heard because they saw us doing the same thing. Or it was people, in these really conservative regions who were standing alone among, the people from their locals and who were being tugged down to vote their conscience. Like all of that just shows me that maybe our leadership is scared. Maybe the mighty UAW is a little bit too comfortable right now, but there is a lot of fight in the rank and file. And that's where UAWD's focus is. And that's where the power of the labor movement lies, is in our shop floors and with our coworkers. And, one little conversation worker to worker, that can make a big difference. It grows. And, that's my hope for UAWD.
Today I saw the statement from the Palestine General Federation of Trade Unions in Gaza, thanking the UAW, recognizing UAWD, the role we played, Labor for Palestine played, and still calling out, the rest of the work still to be done, to, honor their call that they put out. And I think that's just a great, you know, something I can put on my wall. It's like, wow, we did something, but also it's like, wow, there's so much more to do. And that's internationally, within the UAW and then at the local level, just everything. So to me, that's a really good symbol. And I should just say, I guess, like, our ICE amendment lost. There's a resolution to protect one member, one vote that wasn't even allowed to be debated. But the convention did end on a high note. This is sort of the last thing that was debated and then voted on. And you can always have mixed feelings, but it is good to have some wins just so that you can keep the fight going forward and actually put your foot in front of your other foot and carry on and hold the hands of your comrades in arms.
Yeah, I feel very like moved and just like very grateful to be in this fight with everyone on this call and in UWD. And I mentioned this earlier, my whole time being at ConCon, I just kept thinking about my coworkers and also the members I represented before I got laid off at my plant and thinking about just how excited I am and how firmly I believe in UAWD's mission for worker control, for the fact that we deserve so much more over the amount of hours we work, over layoffs, and also over how UAW invests its money. We deserve complete control over these things because we are the ones actually making the products that these companies profit off of. And I think our shop floor efforts and chapters are exactly to do that, to go face to face with management and tell them that we know we are more valuable than the way they're treating us. And in fact, we are the ones that are literally making their wealth. And I think that it is our control over production, our control over our lives and our hours is the North Star for me with UAWD. And I really believe in our ability to fight for that.
Yeah, and I think in UAWD we believe that, I mean, if people say this in many different ways. Margie was saying how important it is to understand our coworkers want to fight. Nevena's talking about the belief that we should have control over our workplaces. In UAWD, we don't believe that our coworkers are apathetic. We don't believe that the only thing that's possible is to just tug on leaders to actually, change how they do things a little bit. We actually believe that our coworkers are ready to fight, want to, don't have the tools, have not been trained up. We've lost the history from a century ago that was this kind of fighting culture and fighting spirit in the working class and the trade union movement. And we think our leaders are letting us down. Absolutely. It's not like we're like the leaders are doing great, but we don't believe our coworkers are apathetic. We believe that they're ready to fight and that we need organization and resources and capacity to do it. But that our coworkers will join the fight with us. And so that's what we see, that we're leading this on the shop floor, not to tell our coworkers what to do or to somehow bring the right ideas and vision and then they'll just do it, but to actually build it together with our coworkers. Everything we've talked about here is kind of one side of the coin. As Shelly was saying, this is kind of just a piece of our vision, but the other side of the coin is that organizing. And so I think it's exciting that this weekend coming up Sunday at 3 p.m., we'll put a link in the notes. We have the second part of our 2026 class struggle training series, communicating with coworkers and building a shop floor movement, to talk about exactly this, to talk about what it's like to actually build something with your coworkers to fight, not just have a staff person come tell you or something. And we're going to hear from folks and that's 3 p.m. Eastern. We're going to hear from folks in the South who are organizing new shops that are doing things like building militant sick outs to fight against mandatory overtime, even though they don't have a union yet. And we have folks across the country doing this kind of shop floor work in manufacturing plants, in offices, across sectors. So I really hope, UAW members especially will join us, but anyone, join us at our trainings. Read Daily Struggle. We'll give you the link to subscribe and get excited about this class struggle mission that we're building. And if you're not a UAW member, you're in another union, get in touch if you want to start thinking about what it means to build a class struggle caucus in your union. So grateful to Margie, Navruz, Shelly, Jeremy, and Nevena for being here, to the many other UAWD members and leaders who actually built our ConCon program, but have also been building UAWD for years. And thank you all for listening. Hope to see you soon.